The locket hit the glass countertop of Hargrave's general store with a sound so small it should not have meant anything at all. But to Helen Leland, that tiny click was the loudest noise she had ever heard in her 26 years of living. It was the sound of surrender. It was the sound of the last piece of her mother left in the world being traded away for wheat seed. "How much?" she asked, and she was proud of how steady her voice came out. Proud that Emmett Hargrave could not see the way her hands were trembling beneath the counter's edge, or the way she had pressed her thumbnail into her palm hard enough to leave a crescent-shaped mark, so that she would not cry in public. Emmett Hargrave, 53 years old and shaped like a barrel left out in the rain, picked up the locket with two thick fingers and turned it toward the window light. The gold caught the afternoon sun of Caldwell, Kansas, and threw a small bright star onto the ceiling. Helen watched it travel. She could not watch Emmett's face. "It's gold," he said, though it was less a question than a negotiation opening. 18 karat, Helen said. "My mother brought it from Virginia in 1858. The chain is original. There's a miniature portrait inside, but I am told the case alone. Portrait doesn't add value to me," Emmett said. He set it back down. "I'll give you $4. The seed bill was $4.70. Helen opened her mouth, and that was when the door behind her opened with a gust of late April wind that smelled of cattle and dust, and the particular Kansas spring that always felt like it could turn into something beautiful or something terrible with equal probability. "Emmett." The voice hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Helen turned slowly, because something in that single word told her that turning fast would cost her some composure she could not afford to lose. Wallace Underwood stood in the doorway of Hargrave's general store with his hat in his hand, and the late afternoon light cutting across his jaw at an angle that made him look, for one disorienting second, like a painting rather than a man. He was 32, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar because he had been meaning to get it cut for 3 weeks and hadn't gotten around to it. His eyes were the color of strong coffee, and at this particular moment they were not looking at Emmett Hargrave at all. They were looking at the locket on the counter. Then they moved to Helen's face. And something in Wallace Underwood's expression shifted in a way that Helen could not name and did not have time to study because Emmett was already speaking. "Wallace, I'm in the middle of a transaction." "I can see that," Wallace said. He walked to the counter in 3 easy strides, the way a man moves when he owns enough land that he has learned how to move through spaces without asking permission. He picked up the locket. He opened it. He looked at the miniature portrait inside for a long moment, and Helen felt the particular humiliation of being seen in the middle of an act of desperation, the way a wound feels different once someone else is looking at it. "This is your mother's," Wallace said. It was not a question. "Sir, I don't believe we've met," he said. "Twice. Once at the Cooper's harvest supper last September, and once when your fence line went down and 3 of your cattle came onto my north pasture. You came to retrieve them yourself." He set the locket down on his side of the counter and looked at her. "Helen Leland. Your father was George Leland, who ran grain crops on the southwest quarter of Section 14 until he passed last November." The precision of that recitation did something strange to Helen's chest. "That's correct," she said. "And you're trying to sell this," he said, "to pay a seed bill." Silence in the store had weight and texture. Emmett Hargrave had gone very still, the way men who traffic in other people's private difficulties go still when those difficulties are suddenly made visible. "My business is my own, Mr. Underwood," Helen said, and she was pleased that the words came out with the right amount of edge. Not broken, not grateful, not desperate, just firm. "If you'll excuse me." She reached for the locket. His hand covered it first. Not grabbing, not aggressive, just present. His palm laid over the gold like a promise, and he looked at her, and the dark honesty in his eyes was the single most dangerous thing Helen Leland had encountered since the morning she woke up and found her father had died in his sleep and left her the farm and the debt and the impossible arithmetic of survival. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't sell it." Those 2 words were the beginning of everything. To understand how Wallace Underwood's hand came to rest over Helen Leland's last piece of her mother on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1882, you had to go back 7 months to November, to the particular quality of the cold that came across the Kansas flatlands in the kind of early winter that offered no grace. George Leland had died on the 14th of November, and the whole of Caldwell knew it by the 15th because Caldwell was a cattle town of roughly 1,200 people at that time, sitting on the border between Kansas and Indian Territory, and the death of a wheat farmer, even a small one, rippled through the community the way any single piece of the economic fabric coming loose tends to ripple. George had owed money in the way that most small wheat farmers owed money, which was to say comprehensively and without obvious remedy. Helen had driven into town the day after her father's burial to speak with the loan officer at the First National Bank of Caldwell, a man named Clarence Poole who had the manners of a creditor and the warmth of a fence post, and she had come away from that meeting with a clear understanding of her situation, which was this. She had the farm. She had approximately 40 acres under cultivation. She had a mule named Porter, a milk cow, 4 chickens, and her father's seed drill. She owed the bank $120 on a note that would come due the following November. She owed Hargrave's General Store a running account of $11. And she owed the Caldwell Agricultural Cooperative $4.70 for the spring wheat seed she had ordered in late October, before her father got sick, when the two of them still sat at the kitchen table and made plans for the 1882 planting season, the way people make plans when they do not yet know that one of them will not see the spring. What she had in terms of liquid assets was 70 cents in coin, a small amount of cured pork, and her mother's locket. Her mother, Clara Leland née Marsh, had died of fever in the summer of 1871, when Helen was 15, and she had pressed the locket into Helen's hand with the specific deliberateness of a woman who understood she was making a final arrangement. The miniature portrait inside was of a young woman Helen could only barely recognize as a younger version of her mother, painted sometime in the late 1850s when Clara Marsh had been a girl in Richmond, Virginia, full of plans and possibilities that the subsequent 2 decades had slowly and thoroughly rearranged. Helen had worn the locket every day for 11 years. She had taken it off for the first time the morning she rode into Caldwell to go to Hargrave's. The winter passed the way winters do when you are surviving them alone. Helen planted a kitchen garden in March when the ground permitted it. She repaired the fence line that separated her 40 acres from the Underwood Cattle Company's north pasture, which was the fence that had come down the previous September and sent 3 of her steers wandering, though they had not been her steers but rather her father's steers, who had been sold in November to service the most pressing portion of the debt. She learned in those months the precise weight of solitude. Not the romantic solitude of a woman who has chosen to be alone, but the practical solitude of a woman who is the only person responsible for 40 acres and 1 mule, and a leaking barn roof and a kitchen garden, and a credit account at Hargrave's that she watched with the attention most people reserved for things they loved. She also learned, quietly and without fanfare, about Wallace Underwood, not from Wallace himself, who she had exchanged perhaps 40 words with across their 2 brief encounters. She learned about him from the town, because in a community of 1,200 people, a man who owned 8,000 acres and ran 4,000 head of cattle was a subject of considerable community interest. Wallace Underwood had come to Kansas from Texas in 1876, when he was 26 years old, with a trail herd of 2,000 longhorns, and a reputation for being the kind of man who kept his word and paid his debts, and did not raise his voice, unless raising it was truly required. He had bought the land from a family named Beaumont who had decided that Kansas was not for them, and had gone back to Ohio, and in 6 years he had built the Underwood Cattle Company into one of the most successful operations on the Kisham Trail corridor. He had never married. This was a fact that the women of Caldwell had opinions about. He employed 22 men, paid them fairly, and was known for settling disputes on his range through conversation before he resorted to anything else. He had a complicated history with the cattle drives through Indian Territory to the south, which is to say he had learned early that the Comanche and the Chickasaw did not owe him anything, and that the land his cattle crossed belonged to people with a prior claim, and he had chosen to conduct himself accordingly, which made him unusual among the cattlemen of his era, and which had earned him a reputation, depending on who you asked, for either uncommon decency or suspicious softness. He had known about Helen Leland's situation since November, not because anyone had told him in particular, but because he was the kind of man who paid attention to the territory around him, the way a good rancher pays attention to the condition of his grass, systematically and with genuine concern for what he found. He had seen the light burning in the Leland farmhouse on the nights he rode his fence line in December, later than most men would have been out in the cold. He had noticed that the fence had been repaired with the particular thoroughness of someone who could not afford to repair it twice. He had heard from Emmett Hargrave, in the loose way that merchants share information about their accounts, that Helen Leland was managing her running balance with the careful precision of a person who understood exactly what she had and exactly what she owed. He had not interfered. It was not his place to interfere. Helen Leland had not asked for anything from him, and he was old enough to understand that a person's dignity is frequently the last thing they have, and that taking it from them in the guise of charity is its own kind of harm. But then came the Tuesday in April when he walked into Hargrave's general store to order a shipment of salt for his cattle and saw the locket on the counter and saw Helen's face, and something in him that had been carefully governed for 32 years of cautious, purposeful living made a decision before his brain had fully caught up to it. His hand covered the locket. He said, "Don't." And then he looked at Emmett Hargrave. "Put the seed on my account," he said. Helen's intake of breath was sharp enough to hear, "Mr. Underwood," she said, and now the steadiness was gone from her voice, replaced by something that was not quite anger and not quite gratitude but occupied the charged space between them. "You will not do that." "It's done," Wallace said, looking at Emmett, not at her. "Emmett, you will not charge this man's account," Helen said. "Emmett." Emmett Hargrave, who was not a man built for triangulated conflict, looked between the two of them with the expression of a person who has wandered into a situation that has layers he cannot fully map. "The lady's business is her own, Wallace," Emmett said, but his voice had the quality of a man testing ice. "The lady is about to sell an irreplaceable piece of her family's history for $4.70, Wallace said, and his voice was quiet the way things are quiet when they are absolutely certain of themselves. "And I am going to prevent that. You can argue the method with me later, Mrs. Leland." "Miss Leland," Helen said, because it mattered. Something moved through Wallace's face. A quick adjustment, careful and intentional. "Miss Leland," he said, "my apologies." Helen stood in the middle of Hargrave's general store and felt the full complexity of her position. She was a woman alone on 40 acres with 70 cents and a mule and a seed bill, and the most powerful rancher in Caldwell County had just paid her debt without asking her permission, and the locket was still on the counter between them, and the pride that had kept her functioning since November was making a very loud argument inside her chest about what she ought to do next. She picked up the locket. She put it back around her neck. She reached into her dress pocket and took out the 70 cents she had, and she set it on the counter. "That is a partial payment," she said to Emmett. "I will settle the remainder." Then she looked at Wallace Underwood. "And I will settle what you have paid on my behalf as well, Mr. Underwood," she said. "I do not know what terms you would consider acceptable, but I will not be in your debt." "I'm not asking for repayment," he said. "I know you're not," she said. "That's precisely why I'm offering it." She walked out of Hargrave's general store and into the bright April afternoon, and she did not run, but she walked fast enough that the dust her boots raised had not settled by the time she reached her wagon. Wallace Underwood stood in the store for a moment after she was gone, looking at the door. Emmett Hargrave watched him with the careful attention of a man who has just witnessed something he plans to discuss with his wife at length. "You're going to have a problem with that one," Emmett said. "No," Wallace said, and he picked up his hat from the counter. "I'm going to have a conversation with that one. Those are different things." He walked out into the April afternoon, and he stood on the boardwalk and watched Helen Leland's wagon move down the main street of Caldwell, with the particular posture of a woman who is holding herself together by will alone. And he felt something in the region of his chest that was not comfortable, and was not simple, and was, he recognized with the clarity of a man who had been waiting for it for a while, the beginning of a feeling he was not going to be able to set aside. Helen drove home in the kind of silence that only exists when you are alone, and you have just done something that felt both wrong and right simultaneously, which is to say the particular silence of pride refusing to make peace with necessity. She unpacked her wagon. She fed Porter the mule his evening grain. She milked the cow, whose name was Bess, in the long routine of those chores that had anchored her winter, and that she performed now with the muscle memory of someone who has done the same things so many times that her hands know what to do while her mind goes somewhere else entirely. Her mind went to Wallace Underwood's hand covering the locket. She thought about that for a long time in the barn, in the low evening light that came through the gaps in the boards, and she came to the conclusion that whatever he had done it without the condescension she had expected, without the particular flavor of male magnanimity that arrives wearing the face of generosity but carries the hidden motive of obligation beneath it. He had been simply direct about it. He had not made her feel small. He had made her feel seen, which was, in its own way, more frightening. She went inside and made her supper and sat at the kitchen table where she and her father had made plans for the planting season, and she looked at the seed order she had picked up from the cooperative before going to Hargrave's, $4.70 worth of hard red winter wheat seed, and she thought about what it meant that it was now sitting on her table because of Wallace Underwood. She thought about what she owed him, $4.70. It was not a lot of money. It was also everything. The next morning, Helen rose before dawn the way she always did, because the farm required it, and she started the seed drill going on the South 40 while the sky was still the color of ashes. She worked methodically, the way her father had taught her, row by row. The seed drill pulled behind Porter at the steady walking pace that was the mule's one true speed regardless of Helen's feelings on the matter. She was on her second pass along the west side of the field when she heard hooves, and looked up to find Wallace Underwood sitting his horse at the edge of her property, watching her. He was alone. He had left his ranch hand, she would later learn at the road because he had understood correctly that showing up with men behind him would change the tenor of the encounter in ways that would not serve him. He did not come onto her land until she had stopped the drill and turned to face him. "May I come in?" he asked, gesturing at the gap in her fence line, and the formality of asking was not lost on her. "You may," she said. He rode in and dismounted and stood with his horse's reins loose in his hand, and he looked at the field, at the fresh-turned rows, at the quality of her planting, and the look on his face was not the charitable assessment of a man examining someone's charity project. It was the genuinely interested look of a man who understood farming and was seeing it done well. "You're planting alone," he said. "I have Porter," she said, indicating the mule. "Porter appears to have opinions about the pace of the work," he said, looking at the mule with what Helen, against her intention, recognized as humor. She felt the corner of her mouth do something she had not told it to do. "Porter has opinions about everything," she said. "He comes by them honestly." Wallace looked at her, and there it was again, that quality of attention she had noticed in the store, the sense of being seen clearly without being judged for what was found there. "I came to say I'm sorry," he said. Helen was not expecting that. "I acted without your permission yesterday," he said. "I understand that. You were managing a situation that was yours to manage, and I stepped into it without being invited, and the fact that my intention was good does not mean I had the right to do it." Helen looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming up golden over the flat Kansas land around them, and the wheat fields of the Underwood Range were visible in the distance, vast and organized, and here was the man who owned all of that standing in her 40 acres apologizing to her with the specific earnestness of someone who meant it. "You're right that you acted without my permission," she said carefully, "and you're right that I was managing my own situation." "Yes," he said. "But," she said, and she paused, because this cost her something to say, "you also stopped me from selling the one thing in the world I would have regretted losing. So I find myself in the position of being both correctly angry with you and genuinely grateful, and those two feelings are not easy to hold at the same time." Wallace was quiet for a moment. "I imagine they're not," he said. "What would you consider fair?" she asked. "By way of repayment." "I genuinely don't want repayment," he said, and then, before she could speak, he raised one hand. "But I understand that you do, so let me make a proposal that isn't charity." Helen waited. "I'm moving 800 head of cattle to my east pasture in 2 weeks," he said. "The trail from my holding pens runs along the northern edge of your property. If you're willing to let me use that quarter-mile of your land for the drive rather than routing around the creek, it saves me half a day in a river crossing in spring flood. I was going to ask your father about it this spring." He paused. "I'll pay you the same rate I pay for other trail access, $3 for the right-of-way and the understanding that my men take any damage seriously." Helen considered this. It was a real thing. It was a business transaction. It was not charity dressed up as a business transaction, because she could see, standing on her land and knowing the lay of it, that what he was describing was genuinely useful to him. "The access fee is $4.70, she said. His expression did not change, but something warm moved through his eyes. "That seems fair," he said. "Then we have an arrangement," she said. He put out his hand. She shook it. His hand was large and calloused and warm in the spring morning, and the grip was firm without being performative about it, the handshake of someone who makes a lot of agreements and takes all of them seriously. "Miss Leland," he said, mounting his horse with the easy practice of a man who has been doing it all his life. "Mr. Underwood," she said. He rode out, and Helen stood in her unfinished field watching him go, and Porter, who had opinions, turned his head and looked at her with one large dark eye and the expression that mules reserve for humans who are being obvious. "Enough," she told the mule and went back to work. The cattle drive came 2 weeks later, on a Thursday, and Wallace sent word ahead of time through his foreman, a quiet Texan named Darius Cole who had been with Wallace since the trail drives, that the drive would pass through at mid-morning if the weather held, and that if Miss Leland wanted to stay clear of her north fence line during that hour, she was welcome to do so. Helen stayed exactly at her north fence line during that hour, because she was a woman who had been managing her own affairs for 6 months and did not need a cattle drive scheduled around her sensibilities. The 800 head came through with the organized chaos that always attended moving that much livestock, the dust rising in a brown wall, the sound filling the air with the particular music of hooves and cattle calls, and the whistled signals that the cowboys used to communicate across the noise. Helen stood at her fence and watched, and it was, she had to admit, impressive in the way that things done at large scale and with competence are always impressive. Wallace rode along the eastern flank of the herd, and when he saw her at the fence, he raised his hat in a greeting that was brief and undemonstrative, and somehow said everything it needed to say, and Helen nodded back. After the herd had passed and the dust was settling, Darius Cole rode over to her fence and handed her an envelope. "Mr. Underwood asked me to give you this, ma'am," he said. He was a black man in his late 30s, with a steady, direct quality to him that Helen had heard about from others, and now understood firsthand. "And he asked me to tell you that 3 of the hands will be back at sundown to repair any fence damage from the crossing." "There was no fence damage," Helen said, looking at the completely intact fence line. "Yes, ma'am," Darius said. Mr. Underwood anticipated that, but he felt strongly about making the offer. Helen looked at the envelope in her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," she said. "Darius is fine, ma'am," he said, and touched his hat and rode off. She opened the envelope. Inside was $4.70 in exact coin, and a folded note in a handwriting that was clear and direct without being elegant, the handwriting of a practical man who wrote what he meant. The note said, "Miss Leland, thank you for the access. I hope the planting goes well. If you ever have need of anything that falls within the category of fair exchange rather than charity, I'd be glad to discuss it. W. Underwood." Helen read it twice. She put it in the small tin box on her kitchen shelf where she kept important papers. She did not examine too carefully why she kept it. May settled into June, and June worked its way toward July, and the wheat came up in Helen's South 40 with the heartening reliability of things that are planted correctly and given good conditions. And the watching of it, the daily observation of the progress from bare soil to green shoot to gathering stalk, was the closest thing to optimism that Helen had allowed herself since November. She went into Caldwell on Fridays for supplies, and she was getting better at the arithmetic of her situation, which is to say that the 40 acres and the mule and the lease of her small vegetable surplus to Hargrave's restaurant customers and the occasional egg money were adding up to something that was not comfortable but was sustainable, which was all she had asked it to be. She saw Wallace Underwood on 3 of those Friday trips, and on each occasion the encounter had a different texture. The first time, they were both at the post office and exchanged a brief conversation about the price of wheat futures, which was a subject they both had opinions on, and which turned into 10 minutes of genuine discussion that left Helen walking back to her wagon thinking about the fact that she had not had a real conversation with another adult human being in several weeks, and had not noticed how hungry she was for one until she was in the middle of it. The second time, she was at the feed store, and the saddle on Porter's back had developed a girth crack that she could not afford to address immediately, and Wallace, who had come in for entirely unrelated purposes, noticed it with the automatic observation of a horseman, and offered without preamble to have his saddler look at it. Helen said no. He nodded and moved on without any suggestion that she had been unreasonable, which she appreciated more than she could easily articulate. The third time, they were both at the Caldwell Independence Day celebrations, which the whole town attended because it was July and there was music and there were pies, and the community needed its gathering occasions the way individual people need conversation, which is to say regularly and for structural reasons. Helen had come alone, as she had done everything since November. Wallace was there with Darius Cole and 2 of his other ranch hands, not in any official capacity, but in the way a significant landowner is always present at community events, whether he tries to be or not. He found her near the lemonade table in the early evening when the music had started and the light was the long gold of a Kansas July, and he said, "Would you dance with me, Miss Leland?" with the direct simplicity of a man who does not dress up requests with elaborate preambles. Helen looked at him for a moment. "I haven't danced in a while," she said. It was not a refusal. "Neither have I," he said. "We can be unfashionable together." She danced with him. It was a fiddle reel, fast enough that conversation was not really possible, and she discovered that Wallace Underwood danced the way he did most things, with quiet competence and without showmanship, and that being guided through the steps of a square dance by a man who knows what he is doing is a physical experience different in quality from most of the physical experiences Helen had had in recent memory, which had consisted largely of fence repair and seed drilling and the carrying of water. When the song ended, she was slightly breathless, and he was looking at her with an expression she recognized because she had seen it briefly in the general store in April, that quality of paying genuine attention to what he was finding. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said. They stood in the warm July evening for a moment in the particular silence that exists between two people who have more to say than the occasion has yet provided for. And then the next song started, and Mrs. Cooper arrived to pull Helen into a reel with a group of the other women. And Wallace stepped back with a small nod, and that was the end of it. But it was not. Helen understood, lying in her bed that night listening to the summer insects, actually the end of it. It was something. She was not ready to say what. August was the hardest month Helen had had since her father died, and it had nothing to do with Wallace Underwood and everything to do with the physical reality of being a woman alone on a working farm in Kansas in the summer of 1882. The heat was merciless. The well pump developed a problem that required disassembling and reassembling a mechanism that Helen had never addressed before, and she spent 2 full days with her father's manual and a set of wrenches teaching herself how to do it. And she did it. But those 2 days cost her in the garden, and she lost a portion of the cucumber crop to heat stress while she was dealing with the pump, and the arithmetic of the loss kept her awake on a night when she badly needed sleep. She also received a letter from Clarence Poole at the First National Bank, which was a routine notice about her loan, but the tone of it was less routine than the stated content, with a paragraph near the end that inquired, in the polished language of financial concern, whether Miss Leland had given thought to her long-term ability to service the note, and whether she had considered the possibility that the property might be better managed under different circumstances. Helen read that letter 3 times and then put it in the tin box with Wallace's note and her father's last correspondence from the Seed Cooperative, and she sat at the kitchen table and felt the full weight of the hidden trap that letter represented, which was the suggestion, dressed in the language of concern, that a woman alone could not manage what she was managing, and that the solution to her situation might be to remove herself from it. She wrote back to Clarence Poole the following morning in her most precise handwriting. She outlined the status of the wheat crop, which was promising. She outlined her current debt position, which was improved from November. She stated clearly that she intended to service the note as agreed and that she would appreciate future correspondence confined to factual matters of account. She signed it Helen M. Leland, using the middle initial her mother had given her, Marsh, the Virginia name, which felt in that moment like a flag she was planting. She sent the letter with the Friday post and felt, when she walked out of the post office, as though she had won a small battle that she should not have had to fight. Wallace was across the street. He was talking to his foreman, and he saw her come out of the post office, and he must have read something in her posture, because he excused himself and crossed the street with the purposeful ease that she had come to recognize as his particular quality of movement. "You look like you've just done something satisfying," he said. Helen looked at him, and she was tired enough and the situation had cost her enough that the usual careful management of her expression was a little thinner than normal. "I wrote a firm letter to my bank," she said. "It was satisfying, yes." "Poole," he said. She looked at him more sharply. "He sent you a letter too," she said. "It was not quite a question." Something moved through Wallace's expression that was not comfortable. "He mentioned the Leland property to me 6 weeks ago," he said, choosing his words with the care of a man who is navigating something delicate, in the context of a conversation about land availability in the county. Helen felt the full implication of that settle over her like cold water. "He told you my land might be available," she said. "He implied it," Wallace said. "I told him I had no interest in that conversation. I want you to know that." The particular cruelty of Clarence Poole's position was coming clear to her now, the way a pattern in a piece of fabric becomes visible when you step back far enough. He was creating pressure from both ends, nudging the bank's largest customer toward a purchase while nudging the struggling landowner toward a sale, and collecting his commission on the geography of other people's difficulty. It was not illegal. It was the kind of thing that happened to widows and orphans and women alone in small towns in 1882 with the regularity of weather. "What exactly did you tell him?" Helen asked Wallace. "I told him that Miss Leland was a competent farmer who had made her arrangements clear, and that I did not purchase land from people who had not offered to sell it," Wallace said. And I told him that if I heard of any undue pressure being placed on a loan account in good standing, I would find a different bank for the Underwood Cattle Company's considerable business. Helen stared at him. "You threatened to move your accounts," she said. "I stated a position," he said. "On my behalf," she said. "Again, without my knowledge." "Yes," he said, and he met her eyes with the directness that she had come to understand was simply how he operated. "And again, I'll apologize if that was not my place. But I saw a mechanism being used against you that you might not have been aware of, and I made a choice." Helen stood on the boardwalk in the August heat and felt the full complexity of Wallace Underwood bearing down on her, which was a complexity she had been managing carefully since April and which was becoming, she could feel, increasingly difficult to manage at the distance she had maintained. "I am aware of the mechanism," she said. "I have been aware of it for some time." "I know you are," he said. "That's not the same as having the leverage to counter it." That was true. She wanted to argue against it, and she could not because it was accurate. "Mr. Underwood," she said. "Wallace," he said. It was the first time he had offered his first name directly. She looked at him. "Wallace," she said, and the name in her mouth felt like a door she had agreed to open. "Why are you doing this?" The question lay between them in the August heat with the directness of a thing that had been needing to be asked for 4 months. He was quiet for a moment, not constructing an answer, she sensed, but deciding how much of a true one to give. "Because I have been watching you manage an impossible situation with more competence and dignity than most men I know would manage it," he said. "And because I find that I care what happens to you in a way that goes beyond neighborly concern. And I would rather be honest with you about that than pretend otherwise." Helen felt those words travel through her in the particular way that true things travel when they arrive. "That's quite a thing to say to someone in the middle of the street," she said. "I'm aware of that," he said. "I'm going to need some time to think about it," she said. "I know that too," he said. "Take all the time you want." He put his hat back on. He nodded. He crossed the street and went back to Darius, and Helen watched him go and then walked to her wagon and drove home with the August heat pressing down on the flat land and the wheat in her South 40 standing tall and gold and almost ready. And the sensation in her chest the entire drive home was the sensation of something forbidden and necessary arriving at the same time. She thought about it all through August and into September, which was harvest time. The harvest was good. Not spectacular, the way first harvests on young managed land sometimes aren't, but genuinely good, good enough to bring the loan into a more comfortable position, good enough to pay down the Hargrave account, good enough that Clarence Poole's next letter, which arrived in late September, had notably less implied menace in its tone. Wallace came to her harvest, not uninvited. He sent a note through Darius 3 days before, asking if she could use an extra hand for the thrashing, offering himself and 2 of his men at no charge on the grounds that harvest season was the kind of time when neighbors helped neighbors, and he was her neighbor and he had a Sunday free. Helen wrote back. She said yes. He came on Sunday with Darius and a man named Ben Chastain, who was the youngest of his ranch hands and who had a genuine talent for mechanical things, including the operation of a thrashing setup. And the 4 of them worked through the Sunday in the particular companionable efficiency that comes from a task that is large enough to require cooperation and straightforward enough that people can talk while they do it. Helen discovered in those hours that Wallace was funny in a dry, understated way she had not anticipated. That Darius Cole had an opinion about every subject, and expressed it with the confident economy of someone who had spent years doing so in the company of people who listened. That Ben Chastain, 19 years old and from a Tennessee farming family, was so homesick for his mother's cooking that the mention of anything Helen's kitchen had produced brought him to a state of emotional transparency that was genuinely touching. She fed them lunch at her kitchen table, the full table that she had not used for a full meal since her father died, and the sound of other people's voices in that kitchen did something to the space that she had not known she missed until it was happening. After Darius and Ben had taken the wagon back to the Underwood range, Wallace stayed to help Helen secure the grain in her small barn, because there was weather coming and the grain needed cover. They worked together in the late afternoon light, moving sacks, and the work was close in the way that physical work in a small space tends to be close. And at one point they were both reaching for the same corner of a heavy sack, and their hands met, and they both went still. Helen looked up and found his face very near hers in the dusty gold light of the barn. "Helen," he said, and her name in his voice was a thing she felt in her sternum. "Don't say anything foolish," she said, but she said it quietly. "I was going to say I think you are the most capable and extraordinary person I have met in Kansas," he said. "Whether that's foolish is your call." She looked at him in the barn light for a long moment, and all of the careful distance she had been maintaining since April was present in the space between them. And on the other side of it was this man who had covered her mother's locket with his hand, and apologized for it afterward, and threatened his bank's most profitable account on her behalf, and came on his Sunday to help with her harvest. And the distance felt, suddenly, like something she had been maintaining out of fear rather than sense. "It is not foolish," she said. He moved very slightly closer, and she did not move away, and what happened next was the gentlest, most careful, most deliberate first kiss Helen Leland had ever experienced. A question asked with full willingness to hear no as an answer, and she answered it, and the harvest dust settled around them in the autumn light, and outside the barn the wheat was in and the Kansas sky was going the dark gold of late September, and the thing that had been beginning since April arrived, finally. At a place it could rest, they spent the autumn in the careful construction of something real. Wallace came to her farm twice a week when he could manage it, and Helen went to town on her Fridays, and they had begun, without formally discussing it, to have dinner together at the small restaurant that operated off the hotel when she was there. Caldwell had opinions about this, because Caldwell always had opinions, and the opinions ranged from Mrs. Cooper's genuine delight to Emmett Hargrave's knowing nod to Clarence Poole's careful recalibration of his attitude toward the Leland account. Helen watched the community's watching of them with a combination of privacy and pragmatism. She did not perform the relationship for the town's entertainment, but she also did not hide it, because hiding implied shame, and she had no shame about Wallace Underwood. She had, instead, a growing and remarkable feeling that the world made more sense when he was in it, which was both an inconvenient thing to discover and an inescapably true one. They had their first real argument in October. It was about the bank note. Wallace had, without asking her, spoken to Clarence Poole about restructuring the note's terms, citing the successful harvest and the property's improving condition. He had done this as an advocate, not a purchaser, presenting a case for better terms on Helen's behalf based on her farming record. Helen found out when Poole sent her a letter offering revised terms that were meaningfully better than her original agreement, and the letter mentioned Mr. Underwood's representations on her behalf as a contributing factor, and Helen sat at her kitchen table and felt the particular betrayal of having her affairs managed by someone who had not been authorized to manage them, even someone who loved her, even someone who had done it well. She drove to the Underwood range for the first time rather than waiting for Friday, and she was not shouting when she arrived, because she was not a shouter, but she was absolutely clear when she told Wallace, standing in the yard of his ranch house with his hands loose at his sides and his expression already indicating that he knew what was coming, that what he had done was not acceptable. "I understand," he said. "Do you?" she said. "Because this is the third time you have taken action in my affairs without my knowledge, Wallace. The locket I understand. That was impulse, and I have made my peace with it. The implied threat to Poole about your accounts I understand, because that was a defensive action against active manipulation. But this was a deliberate negotiation conducted on my behalf without my authorization, and it is not all right." "You're right," he said. "It's not all right. Then why did you do it?" He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing between a comfortable answer and a true one. "Because I see you working yourself past exhaustion every day to manage something that you should not have to manage alone," he said. "And because I have the capacity to make it easier, and it is difficult for me to have that capacity and not use it. And I know that is my problem to manage, not a justification, and I'm sorry." Helen stood in the October wind and looked at him. "I need you to understand something," she said. "What I am doing on that farm is mine. The difficulty of it is mine. The success of it is mine. If you help me because I have asked you, that is one thing. If you help me because you have decided I need it, that is a different thing entirely, and the difference matters to me more than you may understand." "I understand," he said. "I genuinely do." "Good," she said. "Then we can discuss the banknotes' revised terms, because they are actually more favorable than I expected, and I would like to know exactly what you said." He told her. She listened. And then she said, "I'm going to accept the revised terms because they make financial sense, and I'm going to send Poole a letter confirming them with no reference to your involvement, and this is the last time your name appears in my banking arrangements without my knowledge." "Agreed," he said. "Good," she said. And then the anger had done its work, and what was underneath it was the other thing, the complicated and certain feeling, and she looked at him in the October wind and said, "I am not easy to love, Wallace." "No," he said, "you're not. You're clear and you're honest and you hold your own ground and you don't accept charity and you will not be managed. Those things are not easy." He looked at her. "They are also precisely what I love about you." The words settled between them for the first time. Love. Helen felt it arrive in her chest the way the first real warm day of spring arrives, not with an explosion but with a slow, spreading certainty. "I love you too," she said. "Which is why this matters enough to fight about." Wallace smiled then, a real smile, the kind she had only seen a few times, and each time it had the quality of weather clearing, something that changed the whole aspect of the landscape. "Then I'm glad we fought about it," he said. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday in November, almost exactly 1 year after George Leland's death, and he did it in the simplest possible way, which was to say he asked her directly without ceremony or elaborate preparation, standing in her kitchen after supper while they were washing dishes together, the most ordinary possible setting, which Helen had come to understand was characteristic of Wallace. That he did important things without dressing them in occasion because the important thing was the thing itself, not the staging. "Marry me," he said. He said it straight, looking at her. Helen set down the plate she was drying. She had been thinking about this since September. She had been thinking about what it meant to say yes to someone, what you gave and what you kept. How a woman in 1882, who had spent a year learning the precise weight and shape of her own independence, navigated the merging of that independence with another person's life, without losing the part of herself that had been built in the fire of managing alone. She had talked about it, actually, with Darius Cole's wife, a woman named Aurelia who had come to Kansas from Missouri, and who had made that same negotiation in a context that was harder and with stakes that were higher, because a black woman in Kansas in 1882 was navigating injustices that Helen, white and property-owning, did not face in the same way. And Aurelia Cole had looked at Helen across a kitchen table and said, "The question is whether you trust him to hold what matters to you the same way he holds what matters to him. That's the whole question. Everything else you can work out." Helen trusted Wallace Underwood. She trusted him specifically and clearly, and with the kind of trust that is built on evidence rather than feeling, which was the only kind of trust she had ever been able to offer. "Yes," she said. He breathed out slowly, as though he had been holding that breath longer than just this moment, and he was, she realized, looking at the quality of his relief. He had been genuinely uncertain, which meant he had not taken her for granted, which meant exactly what she needed it to mean. He crossed the kitchen and he kissed her, and it was different from September in the barn, less careful, more certain, the kiss of people who have decided, and Helen put her arms around him and felt the specific warmth of belonging not as a loss of herself, but as an addition to herself, which was the thing she had needed to understand before she could say yes. They were married in January of 1883 at the Caldwell Methodist Church, in a ceremony that was brief and uncomplicated, and attended by the community in numbers that indicated both genuine affection and the town's investment in having watched this particular romance develop across 8 months of Fridays and harvest Sundays, and the general store encounter that had been retold so many times that Emmett Hargrave had begun to moderate his version of it for drama. Darius Cole was Wallace's witness. Aurelia Cole stood with Helen, because Helen had come to count Aurelia as her closest friend in those autumn months, which was a friendship that mattered to both of them more than the social conventions of the time would have easily accommodated. But both women had collectively decided to accommodate it anyway. Helen wore her mother's locket. She had not taken it off since the day Wallace's hand covered it on Hargrave's counter, except to sleep, and she wore it to her wedding under the collar of the dress she had made from a length of cream-colored wool that Aurelia had helped her cut and sew through 3 evenings of conversation and work. When she and Wallace stood in front of the Methodist minister and she looked at his face, she felt the specific clarity of a right decision, the sensation of 2 separate things fitting together with the particular satisfaction of something that is genuinely aligned. After the ceremony, standing outside the church in the January cold with the Caldwell community flowing around them, Emmett Hargrave shook Wallace's hand and then, because he was Emmett, could not resist saying, "I want it noted that I had the locket appraised properly, and it was worth considerably more than $4. Helen looked at him. "Emmett," she said. "Just saying," he said, and walked away before she could respond, which was the most self-preserving decision he made all year. They merged the households with the practical clarity of 2 people who had both been running operations independently for long enough to understand logistics. Helen's 40 acres were incorporated into a formal arrangement with the Underwood Range, but titled in her name, which Wallace had proposed and she had agreed to because it was the right structure. The land was hers. The partnership was theirs. She brought her father's seed drill and her mother's kitchen table and Porter the mule, who had opinions about the relocation, but eventually settled into the larger Underwood barn, with the sullen acceptance that characterized his approach to most changes. The Underwood ranch house was larger than the Leland farmhouse, a full-size structure built in 1878 with the proceeds of Wallace's second successful cattle drive, with a kitchen that had a proper cast iron range and enough room for people. And Helen moved through it in those first weeks, learning its particular rhythms and making some changes and leaving others as they were. And Wallace watched this process with the attention of a man who understood that she was making a home, not just occupying a house, and who had the wisdom to give her the space to do it. Spring came again to the Kansas flatlands, and Helen planted her South 40 with the particular pleasure of someone planting land they know well, and Wallace expanded the North Pasture fencing project that he had been planning since autumn, and the farm and the cattle operation ran alongside each other in the practical interdependence of adjacent enterprises managed by people who trusted each other. They argued sometimes, which Helen had expected and which Wallace had also expected, because 2 strong and opinionated people living in close quarters will sometimes disagree, and the arguments were the real kind, the kind where both people say what they actually think and then listen to what the other person actually thinks. And while not always comfortable, they always resulted in something more clarified than what had preceded them. Helen began keeping accounts for the combined operation, because she had a precise and organized mind for numbers, and Wallace, as it turned out, had an excellent instinct for cattle and land management, and a somewhat less excellent instinct for the paperwork that attended it, and the arrangement suited them both and was the source of considerable marital harmony. She also, gradually and without any particular drama, began to be consulted by other women in the Caldwell area who were managing farms on difficult terms, because word of her success had traveled in the way that such things travel in small communities, and because the year she had spent alone on 40 acres had given her a specific and useful body of knowledge about what was possible and how. She did not organize this into anything formal, because the time for formal organizations was still some years away, but she talked to people, and she helped where she could, and Wallace never commented on it except to say, on one occasion, that he thought it was one of the most valuable things happening in Caldwell County, which made Helen feel the specific warmth of being known accurately by the person you share your life with. Clarence Poole left the First National Bank of Caldwell in the spring of 1883, replaced by a man named Horace Trent, who was less architecturally creative in his management of struggling accounts. And Helen sent Wallace a look across the breakfast table when she read that news in the Caldwell Post that contained a full year's worth of feeling in a single expression. And he lifted his coffee cup in a small, private toast, and they never spoke of Poole again. The summer of 1883 brought its heat, and its abundance and its practical demands, and in September, with the harvest coming in, and the wheat standing gold in her South 40 for the second time, Helen told Wallace that she was expecting a child. She told him on the porch of the ranch house in the early morning, because she had been awake since before dawn, turning the fact over, examining it from all directions, checking the arithmetic of her own feelings, and when he came out with his coffee and found her there, she simply said it plainly, the way she said most things. He put the coffee down on the porch rail and he looked at her, and the expression on his face was unguarded in a way she had only seen a handful of times, the complete and genuine undisguised feeling of a man receiving news that has found every part of him at once. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, because he was Wallace, and practicality and feeling lived in him without contradiction. "I am very well," she said. He sat down beside her on the porch and took her hand, and they sat in the September morning light and listened to the Kansas wind moving through the wheat, and it was one of those moments that a person knows, even while it is happening, that they will carry the full specific weight and color of it for the rest of their lives. Their son was born in April of 1884, which Helen found darkly appropriate since April had already been established as the month when consequential things happened. They named him George for her father, and he arrived in the world with his father's dark hair and his mother's particular expression of determined assessment, which he applied to his new environment from approximately the first hour of his existence. Orla Cole came and stayed for the first week, and was invaluable in the specific way that experienced women are invaluable when new mothers are finding their footing. And she and Helen had long conversations in the kitchen at odd hours of the night, while George made his opinions about the world known at volume. And those conversations were the kind that build friendships into something permanent. Wallace, for his part, took to fatherhood with the same focused competence he brought to most things, and there was something specific about watching a man who moved through the world with quiet authority become completely undone by a very small person, in a way that was not a weakness but a new kind of strength. And Helen loved him for it in a way that was different from all the other ways she loved him. George was a calm and watchful child once the initial weeks of his fierce opinions settled into more sociable behavior, and he grew up on a working ranch with 40 acres of wheat fields on one edge and open Kansas on all the other sides, and he knew the names of the horses before he could count, and was following his father around the cattle operations before he was entirely steady on his feet. Darius and Orlia's children, the oldest of whom was 8 when George was born, took to him with the cheerful superiority that older children bring to babies, and the Leland Underwood and Cole families were at each other's tables often enough that George grew up understanding the friendship between them as simply part of the normal architecture of the world, which Helen felt was one of the better gifts they could give him. In the autumn of 1885, a season when the wheat was good and the cattle prices were firm, and the ranch was running with the organized efficiency of an operation that has found its best shape, Helen sat at her kitchen table with the accounts ledger open, and the lamp lit, and the sound of Wallace reading aloud from a newspaper in the adjacent room, a habit he had developed because she liked hearing what was happening in the wider world while she worked, and she looked at the numbers in the ledger, which were solid and clear and unambiguous, and felt something that she had not felt in the early months, something that was not merely survival and not merely sustainability, but was genuinely, unmistakably, a prosperous life. She looked up and through the doorway into the room where Wallace sat with the paper, his boots off and his feet on the footstool the way she always told him not to put them, his voice carrying the news of the wider world into their kitchen. And George was asleep upstairs in the room they had made for him, with the quilt that Aurelia had pieced together from the remnants of both their household's fabrics. And the wheat was stored in the barn, and the cattle were on the winter pasture. And the Underwood Cattle Company was solid, and the Leland grain fields were producing, and the banknote had been paid in full the previous November on its exact due date, which Helen had managed with the particular satisfaction of someone settling the last piece of a long accounting. She closed the ledger. "Wallace," she said. He looked up. "I think we should plant another 20 acres next spring," she said. "The southeast section. The soil analysis is good." He set the paper down. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. She smiled at him, and he smiled back, and in that exchange was the whole of it, the improbable and genuine fact of two people who had arrived at each other through the particular combination of a locket on a counter and $4.70 in pride and practicality, and a mule with opinions, and an argument in a kitchen, and a proposal over dishwater and a decade's worth of Kansas seasons, and who had built, in the space between them, something that was not easy but was exactly real. Helen reached up and touched the locket at her throat, as she did sometimes without thinking, the reflex of 11 years. Her mother's face was in there, the young Richmond girl who had become a Kansas farm wife and who had pressed this piece of gold into her daughter's hand in 1871 and said, with the economy of a woman who understood that time was limited, that she should keep it always. Helen had kept it. More than that, she had built a life around the moment of almost losing it, which was perhaps not the most conventional architectural principle, but which had turned out, in practice, to work remarkably well. There was a second child coming, she was fairly certain, though she had not yet said anything to Wallace, and she was turning that knowledge over in the quiet part of her mind the way she turned all important things over before she gave them voice. And she thought about the South 40 and the new Southeast section, and the boy upstairs and the man in the next room, and the $4.70 that had been the hinge of everything. In April of 1886, a daughter arrived, and they named her Clara for Helen's mother, and she had Helen's coloring and Wallace's calm, and she was born into a house full of people who were ready for her, and a farm that was running well, and a family that had been built deliberately, choice by choice, out of the materials of crisis and consequence and the specific stubborn dignity of a woman who would not sell her last piece of gold without a fight. George was too and deeply skeptical of the new arrangement for approximately 3 weeks, and then became, with the decisive adjustment of small children, her fiercest advocate and her loudest herald whenever she made a sound. Wallace watched his children in the mornings with the same quality of attention he brought to the wheat fields and the cattle and the woman he had married, the focused and genuine care of someone who understood that the things worth having require that kind of attention, sustained and honest and without reservation. Helen planted the southeast section in the spring of 1886, and it came up well, and the Underwood Cattle Company's books showed the strongest year since its founding, and Darius Cole received a formal partnership share that Wallace had been working toward for 2 years, which was a decision that the territory around Caldwell had opinions about, and which Wallace and Helen and Darius and Aurelia had discussed at length over many kitchen table evenings, and which was the right decision. The Caldwell community continued to have opinions about everything, as it always had, and Helen continued to navigate those opinions with the clear-eyed practicality of a woman who understood the difference between what the community thought and what was actually true, and who had long ago decided that the latter was more worthy of her attention than the former. She taught Clara to name the wheat's growth stages before the girl was 3. Kneeling in the field rose the way her own father had knelt with her, the language of growing things passing from hand to hand through the generations the way useful knowledge does. George followed his father across the range with the determined focus of a boy who has decided what he is going to be, and Wallace was patient with the questions, all of them, every single one, because he understood that questions were how you learned, and that a child who asked them freely was a child who trusted the person they were asking, and that was the thing worth preserving. In the spring of 1887, standing on the porch of the ranch house on a morning that smelled of new grass and distant rain, and the specific Kansas spring that could always become something beautiful or something terrible, Helen looked at the land around her, the wheat fields and the cattle range and the children playing in the yard, and the man beside her with his coffee cup and his boots on the porch rail in the way she had stopped telling him not to do because some battles were too good-natured to finish. And she felt the full accumulated weight of all the choices that had led to this particular morning. The choice to stay on the farm after her father died. The choice to walk into Hargrave's general store with her mother's locket rather than let the seed go unplanted. The choice to stand her ground when Wallace's hand covered the gold and say that her business was her own. The choice, that first and hardest choice, to allow that even a person managing everything alone is allowed to be helped, sometimes, by the right person offering the right thing at the right moment, and that accepting that help with clear eyes and honest terms was not the same as losing what you were. She reached over and took Wallace's free hand the way she did sometimes in the mornings, without announcement, just the fact of it. He laced his fingers through hers and kept looking at the land, and the land looked back at both of them, and it was, by any measure that Helen had learned to apply to such things, exactly enough. The locket rested warm against her collarbone in the morning light, as it always had, as it always would, the small gold fact of continuity in a world full of chances and losses and the irreplaceable things that a person carries across the years, and which are worth, she had learned, every effort it takes to keep them. Porter the mule, 30 feet away in his pasture, raised his head and surveyed the morning with his characteristic expression of informed skepticism. Helen smiled. "I see you, Porter," she said. The mule looked away, which was his way of acknowledging that he had made his point. Wallace turned his head and looked at her sideways, and his face held the exact combination of love and dry humor and genuine partnership that it had been building toward since April of 1882, when a hand covered a locket on a counter and two careful people began, slowly and honestly, and without rushing the thing into a shape it wasn't ready for, to choose each other. "What did he say?" Wallace asked. "He thinks we're obvious," Helen said. "We are obvious," Wallace said. "I know," she said. "I have decided to be all right with that." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, the simple, specific warmth of it. And then they stood on the porch together and watched the Kansas morning come in across their land, the wheat green in the South 40 and the cattle moving in the East pasture and the children's voices rising in the yard, and the day beginning the way good days do, with everything in its right place, and the people you love close enough to reach.